My older cousin, who I loved like a brother, was once addicted to World of Warcraft. It was horrifying to see the way that game could destroy a man. His cheeks broke out in deep red acne. They looked like hamburger meat that'd been held to the stove, like the afterpick in those before and after meth posters, except he got real fat too. He'd squeeze the rolls on his stomach into a face and say it looked like a new horde race. He got carpal tunnel and they put a brace on his wrist. I grew concerned then because he still wouldn't stop. But then one day he stormed out of his room in a huff. The newest expansion had just dropped. "I'm done with WoW," he said. "It's just a scam. You grind and grind to beat the raid and get the best gear, but then there's nothing left to do, so they just roll out another expansion that has even better gear and you have to do it all over again." This was, of course, the loot and progression model that would define a generation of MMOs, and which lives on today in the so-called looter-shooter, a type of game first popularized by Borderlands and later mainstreamed by its cheap knockoff Destiny, which seeks to blend the best parts of an MMORPG with those of the shooter, these being arguably the two most popular formats in video game history. Its latest entry, The Division 2, takes place in post-apocalyptic DC. The capital is in a state of decay. A sickness has left it unable to fulfill its constitutional obligations. There is a breed of man who yearns for this kind of breakdown in the social order. Nihilists, accelerationists, anarchists, preppers, in any post-apocalyptic media. The Walking Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Mad Max, Fallout, where most of us see a nightmare. They see freedom, opportunity, and adventure. We've all had that conversation at least once. How would you survive the zombie apocalypse? And you know what? It's rarely an unpleasant conversation. There's always an excitement in our voice as we discuss our harebrained ideas to go to Big Five for guns and steal a Hummer. I suspect there's a great deal of overlap between this group and the group of young men abandoning the labor force in larger numbers than ever before just to stay home and play video games all day. It would explain why so often our favorite virtual playgrounds are set in post-apocalyptic fantasy. I wonder if they haven't figured out something about real life that Danny realized about WoW long ago. The game is fundamentally broken. The entire genre is. After 40 hours on The Division, it's with a heavy heart I have to tell you that this game is a tragedy. Not because it's bad, it's actually quite good, but because it could have been a masterpiece, and it fell just short, having made the same critical error that has plagued so many looter shooters before it, prioritizing in-game materialism over in-game experience. It remains unclear if this was the developer's fault or ours. The critics have all had their own explanation for why nobody was willing to give it 10 out of 10, as to why it so consistently lost that 1 or 2 points off the top. They've uniformly blamed its lack of a political message, with some outright saying its lack of a political commentary is, and I quote, "the only thing holding it back from being a full marks game." My take? This is what happens when people are paid to generate takes for take's sake. Manufactured controversy just for the extra 3 paragraphs needed to meet your editor's required word counts. The problem with games journalism is you need degrees to break into the gig, and under the present academic system, the only people getting them are teachers' pets, conformists, and airheads carried through life by their corrupt parents. Kids who did their homework and followed the rules and have their shit together with healthy social lives to boot, i.e., people who have very little in common with real gamers. Real takes aren't produced in office cubicles at Kotaku, but out here on the streets in the mud and the blood and the shit. YouTubers are the meta and we always will be, and they hate us for it, which seems unnecessary because most of us already hate ourselves. Maybe Ubisoft had some of the political heat coming after jokes about the government shutdown and Mexicans building a wall to keep infected Americanos out, but the truth is there was never any political theme that would have made sense in this context. It's post-apocalyptic. None of the issues of present day are relevant. If 99% of the population is dead, guess what? You don't have to worry about global warming anymore. The sick irony is that the in-game America is actually much safer from total extinction than we are in real life right now. And we Americans are infected, but it's not a disease you're going to keep out with a wall. So what's left then? Trickle-down versus progressive taxation in a world without corporations or banks, in a setting where the survivors have access to generations worth of non-perishable items like medicine, gasoline, and beans? Internet privacy concerns? Or perhaps something more cultural? Racism, sexism, political correctness. Because when you're fighting to preserve the last shreds of civilization, diversity quotas are obviously a priority. No, even the critics knew these would be silly suggestions, so instead they honed in on the use of government force against citizens. But protecting the public against roaming groups of violent marauders, whether domestically or abroad, is like the entire point, the primary most important function of any government entity ever, since ancient times. Are we supposed to begin each engagement by ordering the enemies to drop their weapons? Is every control point supposed to involve a protracted standoff like we did with the Branch Davidians? Can you imagine how stupid that game would be? Also, kids could learn a dubious lesson about the proper use of force in a post-apocalyptic, lawless battlefield? It's absurd when you think about it for more than 10 seconds, so that would require a basic understanding of human history and the ability to think critically, 2 qualities the cockblockers at Kotaku clearly lack. This from the guy who said gaming should be more political, and it should. In games like Skyrim, where the entire plot revolves around geopolitical conflict between nation-states of competing ideologies, I would have been pissed off if Wolfenstein had striven for apolitical correctness. And Far Cry 5, a game which, as I felt the New Yorker eloquently put it, borrowed the aesthetic and frisson of a political theme without addressing the theme explicitly, exploiting the superficial aspects of real-world controversy without addressing them substantively. That game was a fucking joke, and so is everyone who pretended otherwise. But there's a reason you don't see me bitching about Sea of Thieves, like how come this game doesn't have any proper commentary on how Somali piracy is really caused by Enron's resource exploitation? And more importantly, why didn't it have anything to say about tensions in the South China Sea? Politics shouldn't be shoehorned into settings where they don't fit, just to appease SJW games journos. As with all things in life, there's nuance. Every game is unique and ought to be approached as such. Politics don't fit here, and its taking place in DC doesn't change that, as most critics have argued. Games like MW2 and Fallout explored DC without including overtly political themes. Though granted, Fallout 3's water rights will be the hot button issue in about 20 years, but it's not now and it certainly wasn't in '08. And both those games were great, and playing DC was fun. The bricks and marble of the shining city on a hill shouldn't be seen exclusively through a political lens. The capital routinely served as a sort of apolitical military headquarters in times of war throughout the nation's history, just as it does in the game. It has been a symbol of hope, perseverance, national unity, and purpose. It's frankly disrespectful and shallow to assume its iconography cannot be appreciated if it doesn't include a cable news food fight. Furthermore, regardless of aesthetic and setting, the Division 2's basic structure would make it a very poor catalyst for political storylines. The game had a total of maybe 4 cutscenes. It's not really a story game, and it never billed itself as such. It's the Black Hawk Down or 300 of gaming, an intriguing setting that serves as a fun backdrop for a 90-minute battle scene. The only real political controversy here is Ubisoft's treatment of dogs, which has sparked quite a backlash among fans. The game even inspired a Twitter account, Can You Pet the Dog?, whose owner, when interviewed, contrasted the Division 2 with Far Cry New Dawn, going on to say, the latter has a satisfying dog petting feature, whereas the former does not. The Division 2 is made worse in this respect because from what I can tell, you can only interact with the dogs in the game by means of violence. Even for a game set in the post-apocalyptic wasteland, that is a needlessly bleak and cruel way to design a neutral creature for your world. And you know what? I think he has a point. Listen here, Ubisoft, I don't know how they do things over there in La France, but here in America, we value our dogs. We use them to hunt and lick peanut butter off our balls. And if you want to do business here, you need to respect our culture. My Division 2 clan name? PETA. This fake news political scandal distracted from this game's real failure, its replay value. On the surface, this claim may seem absurd. After all, here's a game with a dozen different mission types, including PvP, a deep customization and progression system, and an endgame loot loop that has seen glowing praise from reviewers, with GamesRadar going so far as to say its endgame will keep you playing for, and I quote, months, if not years. Will it, though? Just because there are new rewards to work for doesn't mean they remain fun to work towards. Here's the central issue that both critics and players seem to miss with the Division, just as they missed it with Destiny before. It's not that you run out of reasons to play, it's that the gameplay itself becomes repetitive, predictable, and monotonous. Don't get me wrong, this game was fun. The gunplay was smooth and satisfying, the environments creative, varied, and unique, the action constant. I also deeply appreciated the level of difficulty. Too many PvE games these days have such pathetic AI that they practically devolve into walking simulators. But you'll notice that enemies in the Division are capable of advanced combat tactics tragically absent in a game like Destiny. They're capable of doing things like taking cover when they're shot at, or flanking your position when you're in cover. But when we talk about a game's replay value, we're not discussing if it was fun, but rather how long it stays fun. And despite every other critic's suggestion to the contrary, the Division comes up short here for a few reasons. There's not enough variation in the gunplay. Shotguns and SMGs aren't nearly powerful enough. Rushing playstyles aren't at all consistently viable, meaning you have to use them basically the same way you use ARs and LMGs, playing defensively from various distances. Another thing nobody seems to notice is how redundant earning higher leveled gear starts to feel. Yes, your weapon and armor are stronger, but the enemies get stat buffs too, and the result is kind of a wash. Their time to kill is the same and so is yours, so spraying a horde with an LMG at level 30 really isn't any different from spraying a horde at level 10. Much of the combat simply doesn't evolve. They want the game to revolve around the loot, so every fight is designed to maximize usage of your weapons, i.e. grindy, shooty, rooty, tooty, but the flip side of that is that it lacks the kind of tactical elements present in a game like Ghost Recon, for instance, where you can manipulate various environmental factors and or rely on stealth to approach encounters in a variety of ways. Now every fight is just a shoot 'em up. Mission objectives uniformly revolve around eliminating groups of enemies. When they do throw in a wild card objective, it's often something completely unnecessary, where the objective is still basically clear all the enemies, but afterwards pound into these boats for a few minutes. The bosses in this game are a sad joke. They're just regular enemies with extra health and funny names. And the problem with those kind of boss fights is that the boss can only shoot one person at a time, so it's really easy to just pick off his underlings and then take turns pop-shotting him while he flails around desperately trying to decide which one of you to shoot. This should have had you fighting helicopters, tanks, PT boats, giant robots, any number of things that would have fit perfectly into the spongy combat system. The present crop of bosses is simply lazy. The result of all this is a gameplay experience that feels watered down. Every fight, whether it's a main mission, side mission, control point, bounty, or whatever else, almost always devolves into the same overly familiar pattern where I post up mid to long range and play whack-a-mole. Left trigger, right trigger, release. Left trigger, right trigger, release. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Repeat with a Tommy gun, repeat with an LMG, repeat from up here, repeat from over there, repeat everywhere. It becomes a serious problem once you realize the endgame consists only of replaying story missions that you've already played, just on slightly higher difficulties, but which often don't even feel that much more difficult because, again, you're leveling up with the enemies. It's instructive here to compare the Division 2 with titles like Gears of War or Borderlands, each very similar to this game in their combat and character progression respectively. In Gears, the devs go to great lengths to include variety in each mission, having to fight for moving elevators or while riding mineshaft carts, the group having to split up into 2 sections to coordinate flanks, those sequences when they force you to move up a dark street, where you have to fight in the light, otherwise you die instantly from the Krell, blowing up gas canisters to give yourself a path forward, but they're at tricky angles you can only reach from positions compromised by the waves of enemy locusts. It throws a wrench in your plans, and when you play through those campaigns, you'll notice they throw those wrenches at you almost every single mission. Different wrenches. Across all 3, 4, 5 games, however many there are now. There is always a new and unique mechanic, scenario, or sequence that throws you out of your comfort zone, constantly requiring you to come up with new solutions, keeping the gameplay fresh and exciting, keeping you curious about what comes next. Contrast this with The Division, where the most significant mechanic they ever threw at you is when you have to shoot the sprinkler system to douse the fire. It was one lame mechanic in one room in one level, and that was it. The most intense shit they throw at you besides that is, again, having to spend 3 minutes after a boss fight grinding into super spongy Bodhi boys. Not to mention, even absent those kinds of mechanical challenges, Gears gunplay by itself stays fresher simply because different guns, like say the Gnasher compared to the Lancer, require vastly different playstyles, which simply isn't possible in The Division. And in Borderlands, we see a looter shooter where the shooting evolves with the looting. The combat evolves with the character's progression. The kind of battles you're getting into at level 60, Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, are dramatically different than normal mode at level 30. This is because Gearbox does a great job of ensuring the character, equipment, and weapon perks you unlock actually impact the way you play the game. It's not just, headshots do more damage or you have slightly less recoil on LMGs. It's, this grenade sucks enemies inward. This shield lets you absorb damage and fire it back at your enemies. This perk lets you flip off the enemy and that gives you full health, but it also draws every bad guy's aggro. This perk lets you stay in your super mode longer for every kill you get. These are mechanics that don't just change the numerical value of health and damage, but that actually change the way you play the game and the kind of fights you experience. And this is of course backed up exponentially by how diverse Borderlands enemies are. Shields, cocooning enemies, enemies that spawn other enemies, enemies that can only be killed by meleeing their legs, invisible enemies, teleporting enemies, wide varieties of flying enemies and vehicular enemies, whereas The Division really only has 3 kinds of enemies. Enemies that shoot you from a distance, enemies that rush at you to melee, and enemies that rush at you to self-destruct. Maybe we can count the spongy bossy boys as their own 4th type, I don't know. That's it. They come in many shapes and sizes, but their actual impact on the gameplay doesn't evolve past these 3 challenges. Most importantly, Gears and Borderlands both have incredibly unique, challenging, and entertaining boss fights, and lots of them. Small bosses, big bosses, flying bosses, underground bosses, fire bosses, lava bosses, electric bosses, car bosses. And Borderlands 3 is even now set to include a custom boss builder, whereas The Division 2 only has one boss, the really spongy bossy boy, who looks and acts just like a regular enemy, except with much more health, but who often gets dicked down so rapidly that you don't even realize a boss has entered the field until the guy talking in your ears like, "Good job killing Wacky Wally, that guy was a douche." You know what would have made this game cool? How about a mission where I had to escort someone who could actually be killed? A mission where I had to fight my way out of a building in 90 seconds before it collapses? A mission where we fought in the midst of a high-speed boat chase? A boss fight whose challenges went beyond pointy, shooty, spongy booty? Things that were considered pretty standard in shooter games of old. In The Division 2, it's not just that there isn't enough variation between playing a level on story difficulty as opposed to challenge, it's that there isn't enough variation between playing entirely different levels on any difficulty period. But the reality is, I am alone in this assessment. Both community and critics feel the endgame and replay value is high, even if they concede some minor points like the boss fight sucking. This is exactly how I felt about Destiny, where then, as now, it just feels like there are these glaring deficiencies in the replay value that most fans and critics don't even seem to notice. It makes me feel insane. It seems like if developers find an addicting enough loot loop, it will make up for shortcomings in the gameplay. During the Battlefront 2 loot box scandal, I remember reading about how loot boxes were imitating actual casinos to prey on the biological hunter-gatherer impulses in kids' minds to get them addicted not to playing the game but to opening boxes. They did this by relying on the appearance of random reward outcomes, while in reality the rewards were set at fixed rates to ensure players were always getting just enough so they didn't give up, but also not so much that they ever felt satisfied enough to stop. I sometimes feel that in-game loot progression models devs are coming up with these days accomplish something similar, except instead of spending money, we are spending chunks of our time. That is, small incremental chunks of our lives, which is fine if you enjoy the gameplay, but in this game, after the first playthrough, I didn't. What if our looter shooters focus too much on the looting and not enough on the shooting? They're not supposed to be looter shooters, they're supposed to be shooter looters. The stark reality is there's something deeply broken in gaming culture when it comes to the emphasis we put on in-game items and rewards while often completely overlooking the quality of an in-game experience. This is of course how a game like Destiny can be the top-selling looter shooter and one of the top-selling games of the last decade despite the vast majority of its content consistently receiving 6 out of 10 review scores, despite the fact that, and I'm not making this up, you can walk through literally 80% of the content in that game without firing a shot, regardless of the gear you have as long as you're within 20 power levels of what's recommended. But it's no surprise coming from Destiny players. This is the community that literally stopped playing the first game as intended just so they could farm loot caves. It became such an epidemic that Bungie themselves had to patch it like, yeah, not even our game is supposed to be this boring. If motherfuckers find mindlessly spawn killing AI worthwhile if it gets them to a virtual reward faster, why would they be bothered by a walking simulator? It's why a game like Apex saw a huge backlash over its Battle Pass reward not being rewardy enough and took a huge hit to its player count consequently, that the quality of a game would be so impacted by whether its fake, useless, and essentially imaginary in-game items are good enough says a lot. It's why gamers as a whole are now spending way more on useless virtual skins than they are actual playable content. Following the Borderlands 3 trailer, a friend and I set forth to complete our Ultimate Vault Hunter playthrough of Borderlands. I wanted to beat plenty of side quests and DLC, but he protested and insisted we simply farm the badass bar brawl until we were level 72 and had the highest level gear. I thought, what's even the point then? We will have beaten the game by skipping it. It's worth taking a look at what the science says. Psychologists and behavioral economists have known for some time that experiential-based purchases make people happier than material purchases, i.e., we derive more satisfaction from something like concert tickets than we do buying new clothes. I've discussed this before when I argued it was always more worthwhile for gamers to buy playable content as opposed to in-game skins, but I feel it has grave implications not just for how we spend our money on video games, but from how we spend our time on video games, and consequently how those video games are designed. Researchers have observed the stark differences between experiential and material purchases at every step of a purchase, in anticipation of it, in buying it, and in the possession afterwards. They found that while waiting for an experience like a vacation, we're optimistic and excited, imagining all the different possibilities of what the experience might be like. Whereas while waiting for a material possession, say a new phone in the mail, because we already know exactly what it will be, we tend to feel only impatience, irritated that Amazon shipping isn't fast enough. We appreciate our experiences more than things, because we're less likely to measure the value of an experience by comparing it to what others have, while the opposite is true for material goods. Fascinatingly, when asked if they would rather have a high salary that is lower than that of their peers, or a lower salary that is higher than that of their peers, many people chose the lower salary, simply to feel superior to others. But when asked the same question about vacation time, whether they would prefer longer vacations, but which were shorter than their peers or vice versa, they chose the longer vacations. Human beings are strange creatures indeed. And looking back on our purchases, people uniformly cherish experiences more than items because of hedonic adaptation. We always quickly get used to whatever items we obtain, the new phone, the clothes, or the couch, but an experience lives on in our memory forever, providing sweet memories and funny stories. Indeed, the research has found even shitty experiences can live on as funny, sweet memories. Further, people enjoy hearing stories about experiences more than items. Experiences become a catalyst for social interaction and personal relation in a way that items don't. The research, reaffirmed by so many institutions over the last decade, concludes decisively that our experiences provide us more intrinsic satisfaction than our possessions. Part of what researchers argue separate experiential and material purchases is that experiences do a better job of bringing us into the present moment, which they argue is imperative to our happiness, because a wandering mind has been found to correlate with unhappiness. Harvard psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert found that the human mind wanders about half of the time, contemplating at tedious lengths events of past or events that may happen in the future. And the more time a subject spends wandering, the less happy they report being. These findings fit tidily with past human behavior. Many of the world's oldest religious and philosophical teachings, revolve around presence of mind and living in the moment. On the flip side, our most common forms of punishment, detention, prison, revolve around forcing you into such an unstimulated state that the mind has no option but to wander. Subjects were happiest when engaging in activities that brought them into the moment, like sex. They were unhappiest when engaged in activities where the mind wandered a lot, like work. The question is, how often does our mind wander while we game? And knowing that experience brings us more happiness than possession, that it brings us more into the moment, how should games be designed to minimize the wandering our mind does, and thus maximizing the happiness and satisfaction we derive? What can games do better to bring the gamer more into the moment? When we look at a game like The Division or other games like it, consider the emphasis both devs and players put on things. A dozen different cosmetic slots for everything from shoes to glasses, all the different resources and crafting materials and weapon attachments and equipment perks and gear mods, the never-ending supply of weapons and knee pads, backpacks, armor, gloves, visors. Consider how much more depth there is to the customization than there is to the actual gameplay. So much of the customization isn't even necessary. You know, I got tired of putting all the attachments on my guns and gear every time I wore new gear and guns, because that was going on, you know, every mission. I didn't notice a huge difference in my gameplay ability when I didn't have, you know, the extra 10% recoil reduction from the red dot sight or whatever. So much of the customization is just there for the customization. Meanwhile, we have gameplay that basically lacks boss fights or environmental mechanics, things that have been considered bare minimum standards for shooters going back a decade. The research suggests there's no reason to think that all that stuff is going to heighten the satisfaction you get out of the game. You'll feel impatient when grinding for that gun, and the joy of acquiring it will be fleeting. The next day, the next hour, your mind will resume its wandering because you got used to having the new shiny gun that you wanted so bad. What if things were flipped instead? What if instead of thousands of meticulous individual virtual possessions, there were instead a few dozen more in-game mechanics? Imagine if this game had, you know, I don't know, executions, bayonet charges, flamethrowers, traps and bait, weather patterns, vehicle gameplay, semi-destructible environments. Maybe we could blow up all the cars on the streets, you know, buildings whose windows broke. More action skills, you know, instead of just drones, let me call in some of those robot dogs, different versions of them. Let me call in my own RCXDs, let me call in mortar strikes and napalm, let me drag my downed friend to safety, or throw his body over my shoulder for an epic escape. Imagine if every boss fight had a unique set of mechanics like the final raid does. Even better, imagine if the final raid boss wasn't just another big spongy boy with a different name. Wouldn't some of these things be preferable to the ridiculous amount of in-game stuff there is? And when so much of it only barely complements the gameplay, and is obviously only there to give you something to grind towards, even if the grind itself is unnecessary to beat the game? Even when the grind itself becomes kind of dull because every fight is the same? Once I got used to the game's controls, I did not feel like this game kept me in the moment after I got so used to the repetitive motions of the gameplay that I could do it on autopilot. It's exactly how I felt about Destiny, except it was 10 times worse on that game. But what if we stopped focusing on incentives and gear and loot and skin, and we instead focused on the experience, the intensity, the dynamics, the novelty? It's not surprising we've behaved this way up until now. It's how we've been conditioned since birth, whether it's school, work, or Destiny strikes. We spend huge swaths of our time, of our lives, doing things we don't enjoy doing in the pursuit of stuff that we've been led to believe will give us that happiness we're desperate for, but which the science tells us it simply can't. In our real lives, only 29% of millennials feel engaged at work. More and more researchers are finding that even those in high-paying elite jobs are miserable and generally dissatisfied with their lives. Therapists have found a booming market among America's richest citizens for wealth therapy, counseling specifically tailored to people who are miserable because they have lots of money. They're like dogs who caught the fire truck and suffered an existential crisis when they realized they don't know what to do with it. Many contemporary writers feel that we have made work our new religion, and tragically it has led us into misery and nihilism. Even more tragically, it feels more and more like we've imported this futile exercise into our gaming. Reading about how miserable the working class is up and down the pay scale, it feels eerily reminiscent of how dissatisfied gamers always are with their games. Whether it's Destiny, Call of Duty, Anthem, Apex, the First Division, or increasingly the latest Division, there's always so much letdown and frustration, and it so often revolves around the quality, quantity, or pricing of the in-game rewards and possessions. But what if the real problem isn't that devs aren't being generous enough with the loot, or they're being too generous? It's not that this or that item is too difficult or not powerful enough for how rare it is. It's not that these rewards don't look cool enough. What if the real problem is that gamers are chasing and devs are trying to provide a high that simply doesn't exist? Our obsession with things is a problem that has plagued humanity since ancient times, when Moses was warned his people would abandon the glory of God for a statue of a cow. Are we not making the same mistakes today?